And we do want to let you know that we will be recording this meeting. So while you're in the meeting, if you could please remain muted and off video during the presentations, that would be great. There will be time for a Q&A we have one breakout session after our speakers. So there will be time for plenty of Q&A during that. If you have any technical issues, you can join us by phone at the number listed on the slide. And again, the presentation portion of this webinar is being recorded and it'll be available at cfleads.org. And I'll also send a link tomorrow to all of the participants. And now I'm going to hand it over to Deborah Elwood, the President and CEO of CFLeads.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and welcome everyone. We are really pleased that you're all able to join, excuse me, this webinar that's being offered jointly by CFLeads and the Philanthropic Initiative on how community foundations are responding to the significant federal dollars that are coming down to communities through the American Rescue Plan Act, which we also know as ARPA. For those of you who don't know, CFLeads is the country's national network of community foundations working together to build strong communities. And TPI is a philanthropic consulting group working with funders to increase the impact of their philanthropy. And since 2012, TPI has been housed within the Boston Foundation, but continues to work nationally and globally. TPI and CFLeads connected when we at CFLeads heard about some of the research that TPI was doing on behalf of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving around how community foundations are, in fact, responding to the infusion of ARPA dollars. And so we determined that the field was really interested in this and that it really would be a good topic for a broad webinar. So next slide, Rachel. So we put together a rich agenda for you today. First, you will hear from TPI about what they found in interviews with 8 community foundations. And then we'll hear from 4 community foundations, including Hartford, about how they are responding to this incredible infusion of resources in their respective communities and whether their communities are local, regional, or even statewide. So each foundation will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A, and you'll be able to select which, we'll break out into 4 breakout groups, each foundation with 1, and you'll be able to determine which one you want to participate in for those 15, 20 minutes. Next slide, please. So we will first hear from Leslie Pine, who's the managing partner of the Philanthropic Initiative, and Lisa Payne-Simon, who's a partner at the Philanthropic Initiative. They'll give us a little bit of background on ARPA and exactly what ARPA is, and then a summary of the findings of this research they did. Next slide. Then we will hear from Alyssa Gordon, who is the Vice President of Community Impact at the Hartford Foundation. We'll also hear from Neil Steinberg, who is President and CEO of the Rhode Island Foundation. Also, Sue Peters, who is the Vice President of Community Impact at the Community Foundation of Greater Flint. And then Stratton Lloyd, who is the Executive Vice President and COO at the Essex County Community Foundation. You can see these are all very different community foundations from large, medium, and small. And I think what you'll see is there really are some common themes in the roles that they are taking on, but they're also doing some things that are very particular to their own skills and their own settings. So I'm going to turn it over to Leslie and Lisa.
Thank you, Deborah. Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Pine. Deborah, I also really want to thank you and your team at CFLeads for the really important work that you're doing with community foundations around community leadership. As everyone is no doubt aware, the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021, known as ARPA, offers a rare opportunity to address a wide range of needs in our country. Rachel, can you go to the next slide, please? Out of the $1.9 trillion authorized by ARPA, $350 billion of that is allocated for state and local governments, including local school districts. These funds, which have to be expended by the end of 2024, can be used for a number of purposes. Funds can help to lay the foundation for a strong and equitable post-pandemic recovery. They can help to replace public sector revenue that was lost during the pandemic, respond to a range of needs and impacts resulting from the pandemic, and invest in infrastructure. And as I'm sure many, if all of you are aware, many states, municipalities, and school districts are still in the process of determining how they're going to allocate available ARPA funds. So, given the unique opportunities and challenges presented by ARPA, TPI was so excited to receive the request for proposals last spring from the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, seeking outside help to deepen its understanding of ARPA's impact and to really use that knowledge to help influence its grant making and other strategies. TPI encourages funders of all types to periodically take a step back, take a fresh look at the broader context. And in this highly unusual and interesting time, it's perhaps more important than ever for community foundations and other funders to consider how the landscape is changing and to perhaps reassess roles of government versus philanthropy. We really commend Alyssa Gordon at the Hartford Foundation and her wonderful team for asking these and other really important questions, and also for their willingness to share findings from the research with other funders. We can go to the next slide. Our goals for today are to share high-level findings of TPI's analysis of community foundation responses to ARPA, to learn from the work of the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, as well as the 3 other community foundations that Deborah introduced. And finally, to engage in discussion about ways in which community foundations can leverage and amplify ARPA funding to advance equity and other goals. To start us off, I'm really delighted to turn things over to my colleague, Lisa Payne-Simon, who will share high-level findings from the research we conducted for the Hartford Foundation.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those of you in other time zones. And thank you so much, Deborah and team, for this opportunity to share this information. As Leslie mentioned, I'll be providing a high-level overview of the research that we did to support the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. Next slide, please. So as part of the research project that we conducted for the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, TPI last fall interviewed leaders from 8 community foundations to really explore how those organizations are understanding ARPA funds allocation in their regions, how they're responding to that information and what they're learning, as well as how they might adjust their grant making and other strategies to help to leverage the greatest possible impact from those funds that will be coming to all of our regions now and for the next few years. As you can see here, the 8 community foundations that we interviewed were from all over the nation, and we tended to speak with either the CEO or the chief grant-making person, the chief investment officer, policy leaders in some cases, but we had a really great panel of people that we spoke to, and here you can see the list of foundations. Next slide, please. So from our research, there were definitely some common themes that we heard across all interviewees. Everyone we spoke to was really seeking to understand where are the ARPA funds going, where are they likely to be going, and what impact is that likely to have, or could it have, or should it have on our grant making. Everyone's also trying to understand how best to proactively advance racial equity. And many were doing that by bringing diverse voices into the decision-making process in their communities, as well as seeking how to influence or understand where those dollars are going and how they're being used to help advance racial equity. All of the funders that we spoke with anticipate that ARPA dollars will overlap with their funding in some significant areas over the next few years. So they were all asking how to address some of those overlaps that are likely and how can they add value. All of the funders we met with see ARPA as a once in a lifetime opportunity. And many were asking, how can we amplify and leverage this truly rare opportunity to bring the greatest impact to our communities? Many people identified challenges in supporting long-term solutions with the ARPA funding. And that really stemmed from, in many states, the highly decentralized spending that's going on with respect to ARPA, the very aggressive timeline for the spending, political factors, and all host of factors that really result in some challenges to developing a coordinated, well-planned regional response to economic recovery. And then lastly, all of the interviewers we spoke with were asking how best to identify gaps and how can they add value as a community foundation, given this large influx of funding. What's our role? Next slide, please. Everyone we spoke to was very focused on racial equity. Racial equity was a major cross-cutting programmatic focus for all of the interviews we met with all of the interviewees. They all anticipate applying an equity lens to understanding, allocating, and responding to ARPA. That's in line with their programmatic goals. And it's also inherent to ARPA itself to support a strong economic local recovery. And also ARPA requires a targeted approach to reach those who were the hardest hit by the pandemic. So, at its core, ARPA policy can really help support a racial equity focus, given who it's trying to support and who's hardest hit by the pandemic. We saw in the interviews, community foundation roles that support racial equity included funding research on disparities, applying data to identify gaps, bringing in diverse voices, hosting convenings to discuss equitable distribution of funds. That's happening in a number of communities, including Buffalo and San Francisco, and other strategies. Next slide, please. So all the interviewees, back please, yeah, thanks. All of the interviewees anticipate that ARPA funding is going to overlap with their grant making in some significant ways. And these were the key areas: affordable housing, education and childcare, food security, workforce and economic development. One of the people we interviewed said that ARPA funding overlaps with our grant making, but it's in a good way. We're matching funds where we can, supporting leverage opportunities like capacity building, and working in close partnership with the city and the county. So in general, this overlap, while recognized, was seen as a positive opportunity for community foundations. Next slide, please. So none of the interviewees that we spoke with anticipated any dramatic shifts in their strategy or grant making as a result of ARPA. They all anticipate continuing their emphasis on civic leadership roles and program-related grant making, as well as support for advocacy. Everyone we spoke with were examining these kinds of questions, like where are the dollars going? Where are the gaps? How can we address them? What's the potential for impact on our discretionary grant making? How can our funds leverage the impact of ARPA dollars? How can we best support nonprofits in our area who are implementing the ARPA goals? Are there roles that we can play as a community foundation in areas like facilitation, coordination, convening, or distributing the ARPA funds? Or are there other ways we can add value? It's a lot of money coming to communities, but a number of foundations we spoke with said ARPA feels like business as usual for us. And the reason for that is because these are frequently asked questions whenever there's, a context of public funding, state and federal funding, which is, very, very typical and common scenario for community foundations. So while it's a lot of resources, these questions aren't new. Next slide, please. Most of the funders we spoke with are collaborating with other regional funders to share information about ARPA, to do research, host convenings, advise local government, or work together to coordinate a regional response. Some of the more formal partnerships that we heard about are with other regional funders are happening, for example, in Buffalo. The Moving Forward Together Collaborative is a number of foundations collaborating, focused on ensuring equitable funds distribution and regional readiness for ARPA. Similarly, in the San Francisco Bay Area, there's 3 community foundations that are working together on planning and activities. That's San Francisco, East Bay, and Silicon Valley. And then in Vermont, there's a number of funders that are participating on a state task force together to help inform that state regarding priorities and next steps with ARPA. Next slide, please. So what we heard from foundations in terms of what they see as some grant making opportunities as it relates to ARPA. So community foundations, their grant making can focus in on gaps in ARPA funding. For example, some of the areas that were identified frequently were services for undocumented populations, also support for regional planning and research and design type of activities so that good plans get made. Support for convening, facilitation, and community engagement is another area, as well as training and capacity building and technical assistance, all in service of helping to make sure that the ARPA dollars are most effectively spent and leveraged. Another role that community foundations can initiate is leveraging ARPA dollars and maximizing impact. That's ensuring that equity and diverse voices are at the table, helping nonprofits take advantage of ARPA, seeding new ideas, aligning their systems work with these dollars, supporting local collaborative infrastructure and staffing it in some cases, and then funding and conducting advocacy. Next slide, please. Here is, in our research, we identified a number of key activities that community foundations are participating in. You'll see those in blue here. And then on the right-hand side, there are some examples of foundation best practices from the interviews that we conducted. I want to encourage you to seek out these foundations to learn more about what they're doing in some of these key areas that may be of interest to you. I also want to encourage you to see TPI's report, which will be available after this webinar in the next day or two. With that, let's move to the next slide. And I also want, so thank you, that's perfect. What I'd like to do next is we're going to move directly to hearing from Alyssa Gordon. Alyssa is Vice President of Community Impact at the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving. And I know we've said a few times, but I can't underscore it enough that Alyssa, this idea for doing this work came from you and your team. I really want to recognize that and thank you and turn it over to you for your observations about this study and other feedback you might like to share.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here today. I want to just start very quickly or briefly to provide some information about the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving to just contextualize our interest in commissioning this research. We're the community foundation for 29-town Greater Hartford, Connecticut region. We're celebrating our century mark in 2025. And today we have total assets of 1.2 billion with annual grant making in the range over the last couple of years, 45 to 50 million. Of note, close to 60% of our funds provide unrestricted grant making for the foundation. And because of this, we were particularly interested in thinking about and understanding the influx of federal funding dollars that were coming in because we had a lot of decisions to be made about those dollars. Since 2020, we've deployed all our foundation directed dollars and resources to prioritize strategies that contribute to dismantling structural racism and advancing equitable economic and social mobility in our region. So we started to actually do, in terms of why we commissioned this work, we started to do the work ourselves. We started to have meetings, particularly with the mayor and his chief of staff in the city of Hartford. And we quickly realized that we could spend all of our time in those meetings, and also that the information was so ever changing as folks were trying to understand themselves what dollars were coming in and awaiting guidance both at the state and the federal level, that we really needed to get some help for ourselves to understand what might municipal leaders, statewide leaders, and superintendents be thinking about. We also knew we needed to have kind of a meaningful level of granularity in order about what folks were thinking, in order to be able to truly use the information to crosswalk what folks were thinking in terms of using the dollars against our own projected grant making and work plan. And we needed to really unpack the public information. There was a lot of public information from the governor's office, from mayors, from superintendents, but it had very broad strokes. It really didn't tell us about what programs, specific programs, and nonprofits might be eligible to receive the dollars, how state and municipal agencies were engaging residents and community stakeholders in their planning, or what they were thinking about in terms of processes for RFPs or even the administration of grant making. So we also recognized that we needed to kind of establish a baseline. So what were folks thinking today, so that we could continue the conversation, which we knew would have to be an ongoing conversation, and to kind of establish a monitoring plan for the next few years. We also knew that we weren't alone asking these questions. Our long-standing collaborations across the community foundation sector confirmed that we always have something to learn from our community foundation and other philanthropic peers. That was made even more clear over the last few years as we all leaned to each other around the pandemic response. And so certainly as we thought about this, we wanted to hear what others were doing and thinking, and knew that there would be strong takeaways for us in that effort. So not to repeat what Leslie and Lisa shared about some of the key learning questions, but for us, again, we specifically commissioned this work to inform our grant making plan, to identify places to ensure that we could avoid supplanting public dollars or duplicating funding stream, to identify gaps that we were uniquely as a community foundation poised to address, and to pinpoint ways that we could amplify the federal support and community impact of that support, with particular attention to strengthening and ensuring racial and ethnic equity in program and service implementation. So our approach was that we asked for letters of intent, which resulted in an invitation to the Philanthropic Initiative, TPI, and they also brought to the work a local group with strong ties to state government service and knowledge and relationships, the Intersect Public Solutions. And this was really critical because if we wanted superintendents, municipal leaders, state legislators to feel comfortable sharing information, so to have those the local consultants who did actually serve themselves and had those types of trusting relationship with many of the public leaders really allowed us to get, I think, richer information. The consultants had access, complete access to all of our work plans, our past grants, our logic models, our evaluation reports. We have regular meetings together with our community impact team and the consultants to help inform their review and recommendations, and for us to kind of learn along the way and tweak our questions. And from the outset, we really planned for this document to be an open source, to share it broadly with our regional and state stakeholders, to inform funding and program implementation decisions, and also to share more broadly with the philanthropic sector, and particularly with those community foundations that participated in the interviews with Lisa and Leslie. So just want to touch on the ways that we are initially using the findings. First and foremost, I would say we are using the finding to educate our board and donors to increase their confidence about how we are approaching our grant making, given the federal influx of dollars, the influx of federal dollars, and to help them understand that we are being very intentional about not supplanting and duplicating what's coming into the region. We're also tweaking our projected grant making plans. And the ways we're doing this is we're really looking at ways to fill gaps beyond direct services that are covered by the ARPA dollars. And primarily, as Lisa and Leslie shared, in Connecticut, the ARPA dollars are being used by policymakers and superintendents to really focus on either increasing numbers of participants in existing programs to, in some cases, start new programs, but in almost all cases, it's direct service dollar support. So we are really looking to go beyond the direct service and think about ways that we can fill gaps with an eye to equitable access, capacity building, learning, and sustainability, so that nonprofits and Connecticut will be well poised to bring in additional dollars over the course of the next few years, and certainly at the end of the ARPA grant period, time period in 2024, so that we will be well poised in the sense that we will have strong, resilient nonprofits who have been able to manage these dollars and be able to share what they've learned and what the impact has been over the last, over the 3-year period. In addition, we're also looking to make sure that all nonprofits can competitively access, these dollars. And so part of part of what we've been doing is we've been looking at ways that we can support staffing infrastructure for grant writers, for understanding what the various RFPs and other grant opportunities may be, and to respond to them. We're looking at providing grants to support financial management and technology that can help nonprofits manage the dollars, monitor the dollars, collect information about how the dollars are being used, and progress towards outcomes that they will be able to share about the use of the dollars. We are also looking at increasing evaluation capacity resources for nonprofits. And finally, we are also in our work plans, we have tweaked them to increase support to the data ecosystem partners and capacity building nonprofits and consultants in our region who will be working with nonprofits who might be seeking or receiving these funds. And finally, we've also, in our grant making area, increased opportunities for all nonprofits who would be receiving ARPA dollars to either begin or to grow their organizational DEI efforts in their leadership, staffing choices, programming and evaluation to ensure that ARPA dollars are being used with an equity lens. In addition, we're expanding funding to support community support for organizing work, either directly funding nonprofits that are engaged in community organizing, but also this includes support that we are providing to develop a racial ethnic impact analysis tool in the state of Connecticut. Pre-COVID, Connecticut passed legislation for the use of broad use of a racial ethnic impact analysis tool. And one of the things that we are doing is to support the development of this tools as a way that community stakeholders, nonprofits, policymakers, and other funders can really understand how dollars are being used with that equity lens, and be able to share how those dollars are being experienced kind of in community. We are seeking opportunities to influence co-funding and collaboration with other institutional and individual philanthropists to fill the gaps and to do some of the resource allocation that I mentioned around capacity building and evaluation, and with it also thinking about sustainability planning, again, thinking about that moment in 2024 to be ready to continue programs that have begun or to access ongoing funding at various levels. We're also using, as was mentioned by Lisa and Leslie, our unique leadership and convening kind of superpowers as a community foundation. We are actually a registered organizational lobbyist in the state of Connecticut and at the federal level. So we're using our influence to advocate and convene. We're writing op-eds, we're sharing information about this research and other information with our legislative delegation at the state and federal level. We are also exploring co-hosting convening to bring together philanthropy and the public sector leaders to examine ARPA plans with an equity lens and to highlight effective public philanthropic partnerships. In addition, we've also offered and are in conversation with various municipalities and superintendents about assisting with grants management, maybe holding some of the funds at the foundation and distributing them from the foundation through our grants management capabilities. And finally, we're widely sharing the research in webinars such as this, both at our, with our statewide partners and the opportunity today. So I look forward to talking with folks in the breakout to answer any specific questions.
Thanks so much, Alyssa. That's quite a list of activities that you've been engaged with. And thanks so much for being willing to pursue this kind of study and be willing to share it with the field. Now I'm going to turn it over to Neil Steinberg, who is the president and CEO of the Rhode Island Foundation, and to share the remarkable process that they use to really come up with some key priorities that were driven really by community. Neil.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks to everybody who made this possible. So the Rhode Island Foundation is one of the larger community foundations. We're also among that unique group, and I know Oregon was in the cohort too, of statewide community foundations. So that'll shape some of what I'm going to talk about, but I would say that the process that we went through and the leadership and convening is applicable whether it was city or region or county. We just happen to have access to the whole state. So when it was announced in early 2021 that the state of Rhode Island would be getting $1.1 billion in unrestricted ARPA funds, and I just want to make the distinction. So there's earmarked money, education, hospitals, whatever. This is the unallocated, non-earmarked money that we're talking about. And our first reaction when we heard that from many of us here is this is like giving a teenager a lot of money. A lot of dumb things can be done with that money. They're not necessarily going to save for college. They're going to go out and have a party and buy an old car. So we decided that we had a role that we could get a group together and brainstorm ideas. As most of you know, with community foundations, with our charter and our independence, we don't have to ask for permission to do any of this. And we've done this many times before. So we started an initiative, we called it Make It Happen, Investing for Rhode Island's Future. Make It Happen, just as an aside, is a brand we've used for some of our leadership activities in the past. We went to the governor, Speaker of the House, Senate President, our congressional delegation and say, hey, here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to put together a steering committee group. We're going to get some outside help, and we're going to provide recommendations for the $1.1 billion as you decide where it's going to get allocated. We'll get public support. We'll have guiding principles that I'll show you in a minute. And they said, wonderful. They welcomed us with open arms because they didn't have a clue, not a single clue where any of this money was going to go to. So on the next page, you'll see when we got the group together, we picked a group of 15 people. And that was just a working group. And it was very subjective on our part. We picked 15 smart, diverse, top line thinkers, college president, head of different associations, business community, et cetera, that we knew and worked with and asked them to participate, which they did. First thing this group did was come up with guiding principles for our work. Not surprisingly, as has been mentioned many times so far, equity was at the top of the list. And one of the things that we embraced, and this came out more talking to our congressional delegation, is that we firmly believed and still believe, even though I think it's gone off course a bit, that these funds were designed to help those who were most impacted by COVID, populations, marginalized groups, seniors, communities of color, et cetera, who were hit the hardest by COVID. So when we defined equity, and of course, racial equity was front and center, but the group felt very strongly about systemic inequalities based on a number of things, including disability, economic status, historically marginalized communities, sustainability, that this needs to be able to go. The very well known criticism of programs like this, Race to the Top and other ones have done the same thing. You put in place programs, the money goes away, the programs go away. 5 years later, you're sitting there looking at each other. These things had to be sustainable. Wanted them to have an impact, transform opportunities and quality of life, community-based, short and long term, and then have a process that focused on these impact communities and public stakeholders, and then added in the data and research. We did this process between April of 2021 and October of 2021. If we can go to the next slide. It was a lot of work. In order to help us with this work, we have a lot of capacity here at the foundation. We did not have the capacity to really do this in the depth and breadth we wanted. So we went to two groups here in Rhode Island. One is the Rhode Island Public Expenditure Council. It is a business-oriented think tank. We then went, as I often joke, from the right to the left, and we went to the Economic Progress Institute, which is a progressive think tank. They worked incredibly well together with and for us to actually produce this over 100-page report and to help manage the process. Our stated goal, this is very important, excuse me, was to provide 3 to 5 transformative, equitable, sustainable ideas to state leaders for consideration. We did not want to spread peanut butter. We did not want to succumb to the lobbyists. We did not want to succumb to the political process of everybody calling their legislature. So we, again, we recommended and addressed the $1.1 billion. It was not the municipalities and not the earmarked. Had many meetings, and we came out with recommendations of a little over $1 billion with funds that must be obligated by the end of January 24 and spent by the end of 26. Next page.
No.
Whoops. So we got a lot on community engagement. I'm not going to go through all these details. I could do it more in a breakout session. We had electronic submissions. People could send in their ideas, and we got a lot of those. We had focus groups. We paid for focus groups to be done throughout the state. And then we had local nonprofits holding community sessions across the street, all to feed into these ideas. Next. We then put together a detailed report on these top level recommendations. What you're seeing here is a summary of a lot of research and a lot of plans that we put out. Housing, 405 million, behavioral health, 255 million, workforce development, 205, small business, 100 million, focused on minority-owned businesses, very localized neighborhood trust, 50 million, and immediate relief of 50 million. That's what we presented. We went back at the end of this in October. We went to the governor and presented, the speaker, the Senate president, finance committees for the House and Senate, and got a lot of publicity on this and putting it out there. The other thing on the next slide, you'll see that equal, as important to these recommendations, kept coming back to what keeps us up at night right till this very minute. That we needed implementation that does not exist in this state. We needed capacity, accountability, and oversight that does not exist in this state. The worst thing that we could contemplate was sitting here in 5 years saying, whatever happened to that $1 billion? So we recommended that a special office be set up to be able to do this, to be able to monitor it, manage it. This is very controversial because it does not exist, and we keep pushing it. So where did this end up? And I'll end up on the status and the initial takeaways. As I said, we reported it publicly. We advocated and sent it out through many different vehicles. If you can go to the next slide. The governor's, our budget cycle is July 1st. The governor's fiscal year 23 budget includes modified but aligned recommendations. They appropriated $100 million early on immediate relief, many of them aligned to different priorities, the priorities that we had. The civic leadership work of this nature, this is a key one, and it's one that doesn't always come up in these conversations. This helps raise money. This is important to donors. It's important to prospects. It's important to the community. The high visibility on this project there's no doubt got us donors that came to support this work and other work. Our independence was critical on this, and we had to rise above politics. To this minute, we get people calling us, trying to negotiate with us on these. They think that we're the ones making decisions on the money. We send them to the decision makers. So a lot more behind this, but really key was the process, the engagement publicly, and then the actual recommendations. Thanks.
That's great, Neil. Thank you very much for summarizing what was, I know, an incredibly detailed and extensive process in just a few minutes there. Thank you. Now we'll turn to Sue Peters, who is the Vice President for Community Impact at the Community Foundation for Greater Flint. Welcome, Sue.
Thanks, Deborah. We're excited to be in this space with our counterparts. I would say I think we are a little bit smaller. We have about a $10 million grant making budget annually, and we broke through the $250 million mark in assets last year. So we are growing. And I'm always proud of the fact when I say that I'm Vice President of Community Impact, because it's both grant making and community leadership. And I wanted to tell our story of how we are really working with our community to mandate that equity is in the forefront of our government's mind as they're distributing these ARPA funds. But what I do want to do first is take a quick step back and give you a backdrop of where we were before we took on this work, because it might help make a little bit more sense on why we're able to mandate equity. So as you can imagine, after the water crisis, we really had to build our muscle in community leadership, and really in two ways. One, we ended up working more in the public space. We had to monitor the funds that were coming in and to ensure that when we were grant making, we were truly filling those gaps and not displacing the public dollars that were meant to solve the problems. We were reaching across the sectors to make sure that we could find cross-sector solutions of how to respond to such a crisis. And we too, similar to what Alyssa mentioned, started using what we call our superpower, lobbying and advocacy. And Isaiah is also a registered lobbyist. So I know in the private world, we're probably hurting your ears by saying lobbying, and apologize, but we really wanted to claim that space and use it to our advantage. We used it, especially in the early ed space. You know, we also were very successful in getting legislation for funding to test out new early education models. At the same time, we received a grant from the Kellogg Foundation that was called the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Grant that challenged us to build equity in all that we do and all parts of our business model, from development to finance to grant making. So that really challenged us and had the underpinnings of how we were all ready to start building equity in all that we were doing. And then from there, of course, COVID hit. So we had another crisis. With George Floyd's murder, and we stood up a relief fund. But I think more importantly, what we did is we stood up what was called the Greater Flint Task Force for Racial Inequities. It was countywide, but the plan was that served as our infrastructure, our mechanism to ensure that racial equity would be in everything that we do, because we knew the disparities from the water crisis, from COVID, when that spotlight was shown on how that pandemic was impacting the folks who are most impacted by it. We knew that we had this opening to build on what we had been working on to really claim that space and move forward. So more specifically then, we are, in ARPA also, through the Racial Equity Task Force, but in what we're doing as well in our grant making and community leadership, continuing to monitoring our local governments and what they're doing on the ARPA spending. The city of Flint received $90 million. And to give you a sense, their typical allocation any year for CDBG and home dollars is closer to $5 million. So it is quite an outstanding amount for the city to manage. Genesee County received $78 million, and Flint Public Schools received $100 million. But I want to hone in really on what we've been working on with the city of Flint. We've had the county's well on its way, has an RFP process in place, identified 5 strategies. Nonprofits have been applying. So they're sailing. The Flint Public Schools are in community comment sessions. We're definitely listening to that. So we have the finger on the pulse of what they will be doing. But on the city of Flint, we really dug in. We had an opportunity to present we have I guess I would say a closer connection and those relationships to really move in this space differently. The city is having listening sessions, but at the time, one of the subcommittees from the task force, it's the faith subcommittee, mentioned that they really wanted to put a stake in the ground of helping move forward ARPA funding and spending, because nothing has been kind of coming out of City Hall about a plan, a strategy. Our residents, our nonprofits, and everyone's getting kind of frustrated. We're hearing that maybe, the mayor's the one making the decision, but maybe it's the council. So Isaiah presented with the task force committee, members of the task force committee at a city council meeting, and really framed it in an equity context. So claiming that one, this money is to be spent for racial equity, and that there's a chance to impact racial equity at scale. And the framing that we are using is the Policy Links Guide for city and county policymakers. They have a guide of the 10 priorities for advancing racial equity through the American Rescue Plan. So that's really what we're using, not creating our own. And then through that, again, we are going side by side with the residents who have presented. The residents and that faith subcommittee, they were ready. They had their signs painted, and Isaiah said, wait, we all need to frame this in equity so that it can be heard in a way that will be impactful. So tonight, in fact, there's a meeting on ARPA spending, and ironically, one of the projects on the agenda is a project, a co-op on the north end, where we have a bridge loan in the project. The developer's asking for $600,000 to bridge the gap and get the store open. And while we would want ideally to be repaid and we're supportive of it, what we're hearing is the council is the one who brought this forward on their own. They created their own RFP, one sheeter for nonprofits to fill out, while the mayor still hasn't released their RFP. So we don't even know. And it's likely that the mayor will probably veto it, but it's our project. And I just show you that as just kind of an example of how it can become so local. But I think that what we relied on really heavily was what the relationships and the connections that we had to navigate those politics. And so why did we feel comfortable mandating equity? As I said, it's, we had the toolkit, we had the backdrop, but really what we're saying is both on top of it, both the city and county have both passed public legislation that shows public health as that racism is a public health issue. And so we want to hold their feet to the fire using that. We also want to say that this is really truly the focus of the funding. And then third, that there is this chance for impact at a scale that I think our Black and Brown residents won't have again in the near future. So we want to get it right at this time. So when I look back, I think about some of the lessons learned, or just kind of what we are thinking about right now, is that those political navigations and relationships, the bread and butter of a community foundation or community leadership, are critical. For us, for example, the mayor wanted to talk to us before we talked to city council, so we arranged for that. And then also just the fact that it can be so local that even your own projects can get caught into the politics, and trying to figure out what your role is and kind of what your stance is related to that. Finally, that you are spending your social capital. Isaiah got a call after he spoke at the council meeting, and someone said, well, hey, community foundation, why are you asking the city for ARPA funding? So that was not exact. We're just trying to frame it in equity, and we wanted to make it clear. And that happened to us very much in the water crisis too, that folks thought we were taking the money. So building trust with the community, staying transparent on our role, and then ultimately knowing that, it will pay off in the end. We can spend our social capital for equity. I think Deborah.
Oh, thanks, Sue. Deborah and Rachel had an internet issue and dropped off, so we're just gonna keep
go
going
right on.
here. I am gonna pull up Stratton's slides.
Murphy's Law, right? Right when you get nearly 100 people on there, poor Rachel and Deborah, they're probably having heart failure. But I can always pull it up too, Caroline. Do you have it there?
I am trying to pull it up. I wonder if you want to just start. I think I have too many screens open here. Let's try one more time. Here we go. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yes,
Great.
perfect.
Sorry about that.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll jump to the first slide. I'll jump right in. So hi, everyone, and terrific to be here. And like everyone else said, thank you for all that organized this. And I am based and work out of the Essex County Community Foundation, which is basically northeastern Massachusetts. And it's an interesting contrast to what we've been talking about, which has been number one, sort of a city-oriented one, like Hartford, two, statewide, three, another city in Flint. And then we're really focused as a county in a region with a variety of larger cities, but not one or two really big cities. It's 34 towns and cities. They're all pretty diverse and just under 1 million people. And we have no county government. So the ARPA funding does funnel down to states, counties, and municipalities. However, because we do not have any county government, they're going either from the state or to the municipalities specifically. The other thing that's interesting is that a lot of this ARPA money came out or was starting to get discussed, and the visions for the use of that funding was coming out in the fall, which of course was during election time. And in some of our major urban areas, we've had a lot of turnover. So others may have had that also, where municipalities or state reps or others that typically have a voice in this were not really focused on planning and preparation because they were concerned about their election, or in some cases they were stepping down. And we've had a fair amount of new folks, which has meant that probably a lot of those communities are less prepared as they've come into January and February as they think about the deployment of that ARPA funding, which can be quite considerable. Next slide. Next slide, Caroline, can you move it ahead one? Not sure if Caroline is still there. You got that, Caroline?
I am sorry.
Sorry, no worries. No worries. No worries. I'll keep talking and you can move it ahead. And if you want to go back to the other screen too, that's fine too. You can, whatever is easier for you. These are meant just to be sort of guidelines more than anything else. But our ARPA focus, at the community level was, much more of a ground approach. I like to think about it as, and was really thinking about sort of, rather than from the top down, was really more of a conversation of the ground down, the ground up. And that really started with focusing on the community. What we found is across our 34 towns and cities was that there was a lot of a real lack of knowledge and awareness as to what is ARPA, how's the money being used, where can it be used, and who's getting it, and how it's going to be deployed, both at the state and the municipal level. So a lot of what we did was just basic education, convenings from experts, and this was ongoing because obviously during ARPA things continue to change and evolve. Continuing to do that basic awareness building work. That's perfect there, Caroline. Yeah. The next was at the municipal level, and within our 34 towns and cities, we have 6 to 8 sort of larger municipalities, which really got the bulk of the funding. And for those that weren't going through an election or a change in leadership, we did participate in an advisory capacity with those mayors to help them think through, the right approach for deploying this funding and the right values and guidelines for deploying this funding, as well as leveraging a lot of our knowledge and awareness around some of these topical issues that the funding can be used for, as well as the funding, how it's being used in other parts of the county. Then finally, at the state level, we continue to move up. We did do a fair amount of advocacy work that we've heard from other folks talk today. This was a lot of times because of some of the work that we were doing anyway in the county, we're asked to come and talk about certain topical areas, maybe around food insecurity, or we're doing a lot of work around digital equity, which I'll talk about in a second, and coming to talk to different legislation equity commissions around digital equity to talk to them. And then a lot of conversations with state agencies who are also all trying to figure out their role in the deployment of ARPA. And that might be anywhere from small business resiliency to broadband equity to some of the planning commissions that were doing the work across the state. Then the final thing that we did in this process was we became a vehicle, both to gain access to the funds and deploy those funds to our nonprofits in our community, in our region. We became a conduit for that, as well as also promoting others to apply for certain funding. And this is obviously for CARES as well as ARPA. And then we're also preparing now for the infrastructure bill, which will be similar as we think about additional federal funding that a lot of folks are trying to get their arms around and think about also. And helping our nonprofits and our community members gain access to some of those funds that were being managed at the state level in Boston, to some of the more vulnerable populations in our communities that didn't have access to the city of Boston and to some of the state monies, helping them be the conduit to get access to that funding, which resulted in several $1 million coming to our county and our region, which would not have come otherwise. Next slide, please. The principles and values, a lot of these have been discussed, so I won't belabor these. Things like equity and data and ensuring and focusing on the COVID, et cetera, et cetera. I won't talk about that. The two I will pull out here that I think are interesting are, one is ensuring the community voice. And I saw this a little bit in Neil's work. He jumped over this quickly, but it looked like they did some very robust community engagement work. And I think one thing that's been critical that for us has been to continue to ensure that community voice, the residents, the community leaders, the nonprofit leaders, again, because we're representing 34 towns and cities in an area that does not have a county government, how do you ensure those community voices are being heard and being represented at the municipal, state level? The second is really thinking about investing in resiliency. So ensuring that the funding does go to those that were most impacted and has an equity lens, but also thinks about how do we create resiliency? So not just sustainability, but also resiliency, meaning how do we not only build back, but build back stronger and more together and develop some of those relationships and think about really building ecosystems in each of the different topical areas that can be effective ongoing. And that's core to what we do at ECCF when we talk about our systems work specifically. Next slide. At ECCF, here's an example of a very topical area. One thing that's interesting at ARPA too is that it covers a lot of different topics. So, when you talk about ARPA at a broad level, has been shown today, it covers a lot of different stuff. And so a lot of times what we did was we'd break down and do some of this education awareness by topical area. We happen to be embarking on a 3-year, $3 million ecosystem effort focused on digital equity and access, equipment, and literacy as one of the areas of work that we do. We do sort of broad-based collective action work, which really thinks about systems change as a community foundation and in our community leadership work. And in doing that, we build a platform that then becomes a vehicle for some of this funding to be deployed to the nonprofits in a much more effective and efficient way. But in this example, specifically around digital equity in this specific topical area, we spent a lot of time educating our coalition of nearly 140 members focused on broadband equity around ARPA, again, as it evolved and as it went both at the state level and at the municipal level. We did gain access to specific funding around broadband equity that we are helping to deploy specifically to our nonprofits, which will be somewhere in the $1 to $2 million range. We've done a whole bunch of advocacy because of the knowledge and expertise that we built in doing this broad-based regional effort. And then we've also been collaborating significantly with the municipalities to ensure that this complements the funding that they're going to be getting from other state money and from eventually the infrastructure bill also. Last slide, please. And so the final thing, just lessons learned. Number one, community foundations are a critically important voice. I know I'm preaching to the choir here with a lot of you on here, but we should really hold that mantle high, and we should be making sure that folks know that we are an extremely unique, neutral entity that can deploy this funding in a much more effective way than a lot of times state agencies can do, particularly when they're trying to serve disparate communities that they don't have great knowledge and awareness on. A systems-oriented and collaborative platform accelerates the work. So as we've done this sort of broad-based, countywide, systems-based work, it immediately becomes a platform which is super attractive to others trying to deploy funding very quickly. And then obviously ensuring equity, we need neutral partners that understand the community, that are aligned with the community, that can hear the community's voice and can be data-driven to make sure that that is done effectively. Because a lot of people talk about that, but how do you actually do that effectively, particularly in disparate communities? And that is it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Stratton. So now Elena is going to put up a message on your screen, and you can decide which breakout room, what breakout room you'd like to go to. And then we are going to reconvene at about 2:25. So I think in just a minute, people